How y'all doing today? Welcome to the show, Social Climate. We got a lot to cover today. We're going to be getting into the Morrill Act of 1862-63 and also the Homestead Act 1862-63. All right, you guys. I'm about to give you guys a timeline to take a look at real quick as we get into the intro. All right. Y'all enjoy the show.
Rain to sunshine, elevate to one mind, demonstrate just one time, come together and combine. The economics we showing, industries we moving, in the streets we growing. Turn a black coal into shimmery and golden. Self-esteem perfect, give a child dreams, cause you definitely deserve it. I don't wanna lie no more. All I want's the truth for you. All I want's the truth for you. I don't wanna lie no more. All I want's the truth for you. All I want's the truth for you.
The Truth for Youth Foundation, an association created for the betterment of all youth, all cultures, ethnicities, and backgrounds, are fighters to equal the playing field for youth whose ancestral history and cultures have been left out, misunderstood, or misrepresented in the environment they are subject to learn and be evaluated in. We want to raise awareness and funds that can go toward programming and curriculum that boosts individual growth, self-esteem, family structure, community development, and maintenance.
All right. You guys got the timeline. Take a look at it. Take pictures of it. Do what you got to do. We're going to talk about all this stuff. It's a lot of things on this timeline. So I had to color code it, y'all. Had to color code it. It's deep. Okay, guys. Now, as we get into this subject of the Morrill Act, oh my goodness. The Morrill Act was a land grant act that gave 30,000 acres of land to each politician in each state on behalf of building colleges in the name of agriculture and development to expand so that immigrants and also those who were able to be laborers could be trained and skilled through school to be able to fill this manufacturing revolution that was going on in the United States. Okay, now the theme that we're going to stay on is if you're an American in this time period, you wanted to make sure that the policy was on your side. You wanted to make sure that the policing was on your side. Up to this point, there wasn't any police, actually, up until after slavery. There was a sheriff, the county, and a few representatives, but there wasn't really a whole police system gridded out all across the country. So as the policies came in, so did the policing. So we'll look at some groups that were around during this time period. Now, we had the Native Americans. The Trail of Tears was going on. All right? So you had Native Americans literally being hunted all across the country as we were expanding west. You know what I mean? So we expanded westward like we were taking Native American territory. And Native Americans had a completely different culture. They didn't believe in capitalism. They believed off of living off of the land. So it didn't make any sense, some of the way that Europeans were living. And so a lot of them were taken, put on reservations, sent away to boarding schools to make them conform to the economic capitalistic system that was set to be put into the country. Okay, guys, so that was your Trail of Tears. That was going on in the 1800s, 1700s, and all the way up to the all the way up to the Civil War. All right. Now you had the slaves. So the slaves were also, under oppression, right? They had their language, religion, and cultures taken from them. Now, remember from your old video I had where I was talking about the serfs and the lords. All right. Now, so these Africans came over from, a lot of them were brought over as prisoners of war. All right. And so they were put into a new serf system. But they were not allowed privileges to at least even have owner, or at least have any type of ownership or say of anything that went on in the property. At least in Europe, the serfs, they were able to tend their own property and grow their own food, and whereas slaves literally were eating scraps and the leftovers that were left over, the animals that the other people didn't want to eat, the pig and all those type of things, and were literally eating scraps and didn't have any ownership of anything. All right, everything belonged to the plantation, so everything came under one house, the lords and the serfs. Instead of having a huge compound, I mean, plantations were big, but everything was brought into smaller proximity, and you had your serfs and your landlords living directly right on top of them. All right, and they were in a permanent serf status actually. So, and then you had your immigrant class that was coming into the United States. All right, they were allowed to keep their religion and their culture, which helped them transition better into the United States by teaching their kids. They were able to give their trades, if they had trades, if they were laborers, they were able to teach those laborers to the next generation. Whereas the slaves, as they got older, your parents necessarily may not even live with you, because they may sell you to another plantation for someone else to own you. So whatever skills your parents had may not necessarily transition to you. And this was huge, because as slaves came up, they weren't taught their language, they weren't taught their religion, their culture, and they weren't allowed to have it. Okay, and they also didn't get enfranchised into the trades that their older generations were having. Now, in the plantations where they were working at, they were called upon to learn how to do things, to fix and to create and to make, and so they were inventors, they were creators, and they still ended up stimulating the economy. If you take a look in American history, a lot of inventions during the time, of things that we still use to this day, things in the kitchen, the washer, the microwave, the the traffic light, this, that. These were things that were created by black people, because anything they made belonged to the master. Anything they made belonged to the master. So we're going to jump right into our timeline. All right, when we look at our timeline, guys, in the 1800s, America was a little bit under some shame, because in D.C. and in New York, in the stock market, they were actually still buying and selling human beings. So this was very embarrassing. Whenever people would come, immigrants or famous people and monarchs or different people from other countries, they would come into D.C., which was the capital, and they would see slave auctions going on in the middle of the capital. So this was embarrassing to America at the time. They were supposedly fought for independence and freedom, but yet at the same time, they still were selling human beings right in the capital in D.C. up to the 1800s. All right, guys. 1833, you had the anti-slavery society started to come in and started to kind of pump a lot of rhetoric about how slavery was negative and all these different things. They wanted to move on to a different system. Well, this a little bit after that was in 1835. A lot of revolutions were happening. Nat Turner's revolution happened in that year, and that really scared the mess out of a lot of politicians, a lot of farmers, a lot of whites, because they didn't want their slaves rebelling and killing them. Everyone deserves to be free, but they didn't want it to happen to them. So in 1836, there was a rule that was established. It was called the gag rule. This meant if we didn't talk about black issues, then they can't expect anything. And this was sad, because a lot of things were ignored that was happening. The Trail of Tears, all the slavery issues, and a lot of those things were ignored with the gag rule. Okay, but the gag rule was lifted about 8 years later in 1844, and then we started getting into some positive type things. I'm not sure if you're aware, I'm from Pittsburgh, so I'm going to go ahead and let y'all know I'm a rep. In 1849, the very first HBCU, as far as I am aware of, I think it was called Avery College, actually was opened in 1849 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Shout out to my Pittsburgh people. If you didn't know that, it was called Avery College. It was an HBCU. Okay, then another one after that was 1856. So when the gag order was lifted, this started to have some people feel empowered to start creating things. Wilberforce University, that was another HBU in 1856. Now, mind you, during all this time period that we're going to talk about, the Trail of Tears is going on, and also up to 1865, the Underground Railroad, okay, where blacks were trying to escape. And when they escaped, they didn't have paperwork. So if they were caught, they were considered fugitives and probably returned right back into slavery. It wasn't like they had their birth certificates and these documents where they could prove who they are and get a job. When they got up north, it still became very difficult because they didn't have any way to prove who they were. They didn't have their culture, religion, knowledge. They just had to just jump and assimilate into whatever was going on there that they could survive and make a living. Okay, so in the 1800s, there was a lot of immigration. Okay, 1840s to 1850s. Okay, we're looking at waves of immigration. Even in the 1700s, you had 350,000 Scots, Northern Irish, okay, that were escaping. Now, the difference, as we stated, between these groups is that these people were coming in from Ireland with a potato famine and in Germany, and the factories are getting away from the factories because they're going to more of the machines instead of using people. These people wanted opportunity for life. They were able to keep their way of life, their culture, their language, and their stories and their history of who they were. That's very important to self-esteem and knowledge and being aware. Now remember, it's true for youth here, we're dealing with people whose ancestry and history has kind of been ignored. So we're going to look to see, which one of these groups was ignored during this time period. All right. So you had elites. Okay. Then you had Trail of Tears. Okay. These people, their rights weren't being fulfilled. And you had the immigrants. Okay, who their rights were not being fulfilled in the country where they were at. So they left. Some of them were left for religious reasons. A lot of them left for labor opportunity. Many of them were fugitives that were just no longer allowed to be in the country where they were at, and they were seeking an opportunity for life and a fresh new start. Ain't that something? Wouldn't we all like a fresh new start? So that takes us to the point where we're looking at immigrants, the Scottish, the Northern Irish, the British, Germans, and all these people when they came, they had opportunity to start fresh and become citizens. I think it was like maybe a 5-year plan. You had to be here and be in a certain place for 5 years before you were adopted or allowed to become a citizen. All right. And this second migration came around the 1840s, 1850s. You had, once again, another group of the Irish, the Germans. All right. And the Irish, they kind of clung on to the railroads. A lot of them went right into working on the railroads. The Germans, a lot of them were farmers and craftsmen. They held on to those craft skills that they had when they were over in Europe, right? We talked about the lords and the serfs, and whichever ones were able to obtain crafts like a blacksmith and those type of things. And they brought those to the Americas with them to help them and their families establish something. Unlike the Africans who were brought over and were placed into chattel slavery, where whatever they learned and whatever they knew in their old land, they were beaten senselessly until they forgot it. They were not allowed to use it. And if they were allowed to use it, it was just strictly for the master's benefit, not for their own use. So we're going to look at some other groups. You had Jewish people coming in, and they kind of jumped into the banking industry. All right, and another wave of people coming in, you had Italians, Southern Italians, Sicilians, Polacks, the Greeks came, the Swedish, Norwegians, Hungary. So now we see why America is called a melting pot. There were so many different groups of people coming in, looking for an opportunity for life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, right? The Lebanese, as well as the Syrians and Turkey, the Turkish as well. So this brings us to our subject at hand. That was a nice little introduction to kind of get you familiar with the different groups that were in the country at the time. You had all these immigrants coming in, looking for viable life, sustainable life. You had all these natives that were here that were being pushed off. As the immigrants were coming, the natives were being pushed off of their land, out of their land, and into reservations. Then you had the African Americans, so-called African Americans, the Africans, and the some other groups of natives that were in being taken as slaves because of their skin color. Remember, guys, Pope Innocent and the Catholic Church had declared a war on color, on blacks, right? We talked about war, how war was originally ethnic groups and countries, and but the Catholic Church decided to declare war on the continent of Africa. So this was a war. These were people were prisoners of war that were being brought in. They were not considered human, and that's what we're going to look at right now. We're going to look at the state of things. I'm going to read you this passage from this book, and it basically talks about how they looked at the African American or the African person. And this is a book called The Cotton Manufacturing Industry in the United States by Melvin Thomas Copeland, PhD. Remember when we talked about Carl Linnaeus and Bloomberg and all these people that started to instill the idea of blacks being a second-class person and of evolution having to do with color and the white person being at the highest elite level of evolution? Well, these guys were scholars, and this scholar must have been under this train of thought, Melvin Thomas Copeland, who wrote this book, because the things he's saying, and kind of, it's just bad. Just check it out. I'm going to read it here for you. The demand for capital, moreover, was augmented by the amounts required to purchase slaves. They were saying that the plantation owners were having, a little bit of difficulty. They had the ability to craft stuff in their own home because the slaves are right here. But that was offset because they had to buy the slaves. Now, who are they buying them from? Maybe the bank? Interesting. Or maybe other plantations owner. But anyway, let's go ahead and finish reading. The demand for capital, moreover, was augmented by the amount required to purchase slaves. And at that time, there was no section of the country that was the capital seeking was not invested in. Local supplies were used for local purposes. In the next place, a supply of adaptable Negroes and labor was not available for manufacturing in such communities. Okay, to be employed advantageously in a mill equipped with intricate, expensive, and delicate adjustable machinery. Okay, the Negro was too ignorant, too clumsy, too unreliable to be to be employed in these places where the equipment of manufacturing was kept. So this is, I had a hard time reading it because my eyes didn't even want to really read that. Basically, the guy said that black people were literally too dumb to work in manufacturing plants that were in the South. So this is why they had to only give those jobs to the immigrants that were coming into the country, because the blacks were too ignorant, too stupid, too clumsy to run the equipment and machinery, yet we were inventing things and stuff. So it's just sad that the scholars and those elite people were teaching this, and this was the curriculum that was going down into America. So if you were an immigrant and you were coming in and this is how people were referring to natives and African people of African descent, why would you think any different? They are the highly educated people, and this is what they're saying. So now, on the other hand, slaves obviously had ability and talent, and a lot of them were shining, and the ones that escaped slavery became great and powerful leaders, and you had your Frederick Douglass and those type people like that. Well, we're going to get right into the Morrill Act. Okay, the Morrill Act was 1862. As we stated, it gave college land grants to people in Congress. Now, mind you, there were no black people in Congress at this time. I looked. So every state was given a college in which to establish agricultural, mechanical, and different things that would be able to give the people skills that were moving into those states. And so those were all the immigrants, as the natives were being pushed out. Slavery was not over yet, so there were no free black people in the South. So the only people who were attaining these college grants were white European men, and they built a school in each state across the country. Okay, now these schools were like centers of life, where you could actually run things in the state and create jobs all across the state. So these schools were empowering. So you could imagine being a slave, and you're looking, and or maybe you got your freedom, and you're like, wow, they just gave 30,000 acres to all these people. So you're thinking, okay, slavery's been going on all this time, so when our people get released, we're going to get these opportunities too. They're going to give us something, right? And so that act right there actually empowered not only the white men, but it also gave all those laborers who didn't have skills, now they had places to go acquire those skills in those colleges. So now you had your women, right? Your first woman here, let me get her name right, 1879, Mary Frank Morrison. She was the first woman to graduate from college. She graduated from Ohio University, shots out, used to be called Ohio Agricultural and Mechanical School. Okay, guys, she was the first woman. So not only was the European man pulling himself up, but he was also pulling his woman up as well, and as well as the immigrants and the other ethnic groups that came in and had their freedoms. So this was 1862. Remember, this is before slavery. So they set all these things up to make sure that these people were enfranchised. All right, enfranchised, right? Policies setting in place, right, so people can have something. Now, in the 3 years, I'm sure African people and the natives were probably just couldn't believe, right? So they're like, people were pushing for freedom. People were pushing for economics to change, for America to go to capitalism. Now you had the struggle between the North and the South. They were fighting over what was going to win. Was cotton king or was the manufacturer king, right? And so during those 3 years, I'm sure they had all type of debates and talks and speeches in Congress about what angles, what ways they should go and start manifesting the way we wanted the country to be. Now, the second act that happened, as well as the Morrill Act that was put into place, was also the Homestead Act. Now, the Morrill Act dealt with colleges and schools and stuff like that, and land being given so colleges could be built. All these senators, mind you, and all these Congress people, I'm sure, became filthy rich if they weren't already rich. They were given land to build colleges. Okay, so the Homestead Act, that gave land to individuals. So you had land to use for colleges given by the federal government. Now you had land being given to individuals. Okay, now the land was given to individuals. I think it was over 270 million acres. 270 million acres were given away to immigrants, to the peoples in Americas in the North, and the congressmen and different people. Now, the slaves could not receive this because they were still in slavery. They were not considered human. So now America was basically giving away the country, the land, to everybody but the slaves. And so in 1865, we know the Civil War happened, as well as the Civil War was happening. So you had your blacks who were like, your soldiers who were like, man, we've been watching 30,000 acres going here, 270 million acres going there. When are we going to get our 40 acres and a mule? And that's our guy, Garrison Fraser, ex-slave, who said a valiant speech, and that's recorded in the annals of history, where he asked for 40 acres and a mule. And so you had William Sherman, I think, was the general at the time, and they were waiting on Lincoln or someone to do an act or to do some type of policy that would give these people land, these slaves that just now were freed. So he got tired of waiting, and Tecumseh decided to do what's called the Special Field Order number 15. Special Field Order number 15 reminds me of Star Wars when they say Order number 66. They had to kill all the Jedi. So, but this order was supposed to give 40 acres and a mule. All this land that had been abandoned by these rice farmers in North Carolina along the coast was supposed to be given to these slaves. Now, mind you, it wasn't across the whole country. It was only North Carolina. It was just only this order. So at least some people in that state were able to try to get their 40 acres and a mule. But unfortunately, as soon as Andrew Jackson came into office, he repealed this act. He repealed it, took it away, and took the land back. So that was not really the same thing as the Homestead Land Act or the Morrill Act. It wasn't an act. It was just an order by general that was actually repealed when the next political party came into office. So we look at that as well. Now, mind you, as that's going on, the blacks were free, so they're looking for their opportunity in their way to try to make it and be successful. While they're doing this, they're trying to work on the railroads. Well, you had your Jim Crow laws that said if you're arrested, you're in the wrong county, you're doing something wrong, you don't have a job, you're trying to get a job, but you don't have one, they'll arrest you and throw you in jail. Now they have you as free labor. The 13th Amendment, if you're a criminal, you can be a slave. So, 14, 13, check it out, look into it. So, they struggled. They were in chain gangs. They had to work the mines. They had to work the grimiest things, man. They had little kids and little short people crawling in holes in mines, putting dynamite, so and then crawling back out. Sometimes these people would get stuck and would die, and nobody would ever go looking for them. You know, these chain gangs were when you were found guilty of something, it wasn't even a crime. I mean, they literally made crimes to incriminate you. The policing and the policies, right? Make sure the policies and the police are in your favor. Well, these people ended up in railroad chain gangs and working on the railroads for free. And the railroad was the number one industry, number one country in America. I mean, company in America, number one. Cotton was number one in the world. Okay, as you had cotton down south, then you had your railroad. So the cotton was being picked by slaves for free. The railroads were being built by blacks and Asians who were held as criminals in chain gangs. Okay, and then when slavery ended in 1865, so you were trying to run to the Wild West. You wanted freedom, you wanted independence, you wanted some of that land, but you didn't have any documents. When you were a slave, you don't have documents, so you couldn't apply to get the land grant. You didn't have proof of who you were, who your grandparents were. You've been moved and shoveled and shifted plantation. You can't remember who you were. You don't have your documents. So a lot of those land grants, whether it be the Morrill Act or the Homestead Act, definitely didn't go to so-called African people or so-called Native American people. All right, so now looking, we're getting in toward the 1865 all the way to 1879. So you had your blacks fighting. They had all these black people that were skilled laborers that just came out of slavery. Even though that book says they were unskilled, that's just trying to brainwash you. These, like I said before, these people were building everything. They were in the house building what the master needed. They could fix things. They grew the crops. They did all the agriculture. Matter of fact, they brought them from Africa specifically because of the agricultural abilities. So now you had people studying them in the agriculture and how they do things, and then develop these land grant colleges where they take these techniques that the slaves were doing and teach them in college now, and teach it to the Europeans and male and women, and also the immigrants coming in from all over the world to replace the free labor, because they needed someone to replace that free labor. Okay, because they know that slavery wasn't going to last forever. They weren't going to be able to keep all these people enslaved. They had to figure out a new system, and all these immigrants were going to fulfill the role that the slaves had been playing. The slaves had been playing below serfs because they didn't have their religion, they didn't have their culture, they couldn't get married. It was chattel slavery. They were not treated as human beings. They at least wanted to be a serf. Okay, and this is what, sharecropping after the war, which was just as bad because they always went in the negative. You could never pay out. All right, you could never pay it to own anything. Your boss owns you. You made so little money every day you went to work, you lost money. So they at least wanted to be there, but they weren't even allowed to be there. They were being arrested by the black codes and the Jim Crow, and a lot of them were running off to the Wild Wild West and ended up as fugitives. Some of them did develop a lot of land and different things and the Wild West and stuff like that. And we have some great heroes and great stories that come from that. And the cowboy term comes actually from the escaped slaves or fugitives that went Wild West and began living lifestyles out there, ranching and herding different animals. Okay, that brings us to about 1886. Okay, maybe some people were getting too skilled. Maybe some women were being too talented. As we stated that Mary Frank Morrison was the first woman to graduate from college, and maybe a lot of other women started graduating. Maybe the white man was thinking, his place wasn't going to be safe anymore. Okay, there was a lot of people challenging for those jobs. A lot of people with talent that when they came in, they gave them the job. And if you were a slave, you would be willing to work for way less because you were just working for free. You were just working for free. So in 1886, man, the market, the work field was tough. You had people that was really, really willing to work for pennies. Okay, pennies. So you had your white laborers who had homes, who had things they had to take care of. They wanted to make an honest living. They wanted to be paid something that would help them to maintain their lifestyles, to take care of their family. They couldn't imagine being paid what former slaves were being paid. The former slaves were bringing down the pay scale because they were accepting so little money. So these whites had to find a way to protect their jobs and protect their income, and they started what was called the American Federation of Labor. And this is 1886. White-only union to protect the jobs of these people, to protect the white man's job because there were too many Africans coming in, too many immigrants coming in that didn't look like them, that spoke different languages, that had different cultures, that were willing to work for less, that would be taking money out of their pockets. So they had to establish a system where you got to belong to this group to work here. Okay, you got to be one of us. Okay, you can't come in and make them and take less money, so they pay us less money, and they established these unions. Okay, while these unions were being established, mind you, the Trail of Tears is still going on. You still have Jim Crow, the Black Codes, and all these things going on. So you had your groups that couldn't get a job because of their unions, were still being arrested by the policy and the police. Okay, they're being mistreated by policy and arrested for breaking the policies that shouldn't have been even put into place. So now your land grant colleges, you had your African people who began to climb up the ladders and get into Congress and was able to put their hands on papers and create symposiums that allowed them to speak their mind about not having colleges for them. All right, these were segregated colleges, so blacks were not even allowed in these colleges. Okay, but eventually in 1890, a symposium was held, and the land grant, it was a change to the Morrill Act. The land grant colleges were given as sister colleges. Not even brother colleges, sister colleges. To where your main colleges would build a sister college, and they call these sister colleges HBCU. So now y'all know where the term comes from. There were sister colleges that were created in the Morrill Act, the second phase of the Morrill Act in 1890, so that maybe African Americans would have an opportunity for education now as well. Now the thing is, for a long time, from 1890 all the way up to the 1900s, almost like 1988, you know, this money didn't always reach the black colleges. Okay, it was given to the brother colleges, the original Morrill Act, the white colleges that were established, and sometimes the money would trickle down to the HBCUs. So there was eventually complaints made about that, and then 1988, some things were done where there were some people put on boards so they could eye that money up and make sure it's going to where it's supposed to be going. I think Donald Trump just did something recently in 2020 for the HBCUs, marking the 150-year anniversary. 150-year anniversary of the Morrill Act and the land grants. So it's been 150 years, guys, since that took place. Okay, now, the first person ever to actually get a land grant was a European man by the name of David Freeman. He was the first. And the last person ever, that was in 1863, of course, January 1st. And in 1988, the last person ever, his name was Kenneth Deodorff. He was also a European male. Just so you're aware of that. Now, to sum up, okay, the industries that were prevalent in this time period, the railroads, they were number 2, cotton was number 1, banking, and then you had your manufacturing. So you had all your immigrant groups that came and became the lords of these companies. They became the lords of these companies, right? Because of the opportunity that were given to them. Okay, migration patterns. The craftsmen, the Germans were the craftsmen, all right? The laborers came in. The Asians came in attempting to be laborers, but what year was that? We had it on here. 1882. They were blocked by something called the Asian Exclusion Act that literally banned immigrants from Asia to come in and get contracts for labor. But at the exact same time, they were allowing European contractors to come for labor, like I said, the Germans and such other groups like that. So America was being very picky with its policies and what was going on there. So, okay, now we mentioned all these different things, and I want to bring us back in full circle. The last video I did, guys, I talked about lords and serfs, and I talked about the war Pope Innocent declared. Okay, if you look at the policies that were put in place, these policies gave all the European and the other ethnic groups that were in America an advantage. They already had an advantage because the slave was in slavery. Now they were all given an education and they were enfranchised. At the same time the slavery was over, the slaves were still being disenfranchised from Jim Crow and all those things like that, and still being a second-class citizen, as well as the education system labeling them as less than human, as well as the natives that were in this country. So you had the landlords. Okay, let's see my picture here. No, we're not going to be able to see. Oh, maybe you can see it. Okay. Boom. See that chart right there? In the middle right there. Okay. Or the landlords. They transitioned from Europe to America. Okay. And they were able to become owners in different companies because of the manufacturing, and also because of the land grant acts that were given land to some people, where they were able to prosper and create a living for themselves, and able to sell, grow food, raise money. They were taught how to farm. Not only that, but they had to maintain the farm for 5 years. So as these immigrants became citizens, then they were able to receive the grants. The time period it took for them to be citizens was the time period they needed to fulfill the span of the application. So after that 5 years, they were a citizen. They were allowed to have the land, okay, and use it for whatever they needed to. So as you had people running into those lands, they would have to acquire land from them, or pay those landowners to do something on their land. So the Asians were coming in. They were locked out by the lords from economic inclusion. You had the blacks that were in Jim Crow, the Africans, they were locked out because of economic inclusion. You had the Native Americans. They were being driven off of their own land and being put on concentration camps, literally. So they were locked out of economic inclusion. Okay. Then your immigrant laborers, certain groups of immigrant laborers were blocked out, and certain groups of immigrant labor were enfranchised. Okay, so it was very important to make sure that policy and policing is on your side. Okay, now the new lords, the colleges became the new lords. Okay, the private owners, okay, became the new lords. The companies, the high-end companies, the banks, the cotton industry, the railroad became the new lords. Okay. Also the mills and the mines. Who became the new serfs? Second-class citizens, right? The so-called African American, who was not even considered human according to their dictionary. Okay, the laborers, who were poor laborers up north and didn't have an opportunity and were being underpaid, and before the union came, and those things. Those people were the new serfs. The farmers, who were farming on land and had to graze the land, and sometimes their land would be taken from them if they couldn't identify who they were. If they didn't have their birth certificates and their paperwork, their farms would be taken from them and given to other people that were coming in as immigrants. Fugitives, these are people who, like I said, may not have had paperwork, were running for freedom, or didn't have the ability to be. They were never enfranchised. Their culture, their religion, who they were was taken from them, and so they didn't have much. So they scrambled to make a living for themselves, and oftentimes didn't have the paperwork to meet the policies as they crossed different communities. All right, the sharecroppers. These are the people who left slavery, did all those other things, and had to literally come back to slavery, which was in the form of sharecropping. So, and during all this time, the Trail of Tears was taking place from 1831 all the way up to 1877. Very sad and unfortunate. So, to me, the Homestead Act and the Morrill Act enfranchised the immigrants. It franchised them. It gave them opportunity, gave them land, it gave them education, it gave them a fair fighting chance in America. Whereas those acts did not get to the certain groups of people because of policies that were put in play, okay, when the Civil War ended. Okay, a lot of those policies that led to policing. And we'll look at this chart one more time, and you can see all the red in there, as those were situations where policies were put in to affect African Americans disproportionately. Also remember that in the early 1900s, 1919 to be exact, and also let's look at my chart here, 1898, 1906, the Wilmington, North Carolina riots, okay, race riots against blacks, 1906, Atlanta, 1917, East St. Louis, 1921, Tulsa, Oklahoma. So as the blacks were fighting to try to have a life in their own cities, their cities were being burnt down, okay, destroyed. So even the ones who were able to find a way to make it and build their own places to live and have their own businesses and try to be their own lords, those places were destroyed and burnt down. Tulsa, Oklahoma was the first place ever in the world where a bomb was, in America, where a bomb was dropped in America on its own land. That was Tulsa, Oklahoma, race riots. So now you would think they could get this right when they portrayed this on film, right? There was a movie that came out called The Birth of a Nation. Okay, and this told the story of our country. Okay, the Civil War. It was 50 years after the Civil War. Civil War was 1865. This movie came out in 1915. So this movie would put in our minds how we would look and think about the Civil War and what happened and who were the good guys, who were the bad guys, and all that type of stuff. So in this movie, it was played in the White House. Woodrow Wilson watched it. In this movie, the KKK were the heroes, and they went around killing all the blacks, and it was white people painted in blackface. It wasn't even any really black actors. And so this movie portrayed the slave as the bad guy in the movie. So not only were we disenfranchised and not able to receive the Homestead Act and the Morrill Act, but at the end of the day, the reality of the situation was flipped. And Jim Crow and all the things that happened as we were being killed, that was replaced by us being portrayed as the bad guys. And the KKK, who was actually performing the Jim Crow and all these black codes, they were portrayed as heroes in the movie. So now anybody moving forward would look at the black person as they deserve what they got. They should have never gotten anything, this evil person, which is also backed up by Carl Linnaeus and Bloomberg and all the history books and all the things that were still being studied in the institutions that the Morrill Act built. So just a quick summary, and if I missed something, let me know. But that Birth of a Nation movie, for those people who didn't have ability to go to get educated, that didn't have books to read to find out what happened, that didn't have the ability to go into Congress and look at policy, they had to believe whatever that movie portrayed. And so why would you think that slaves should get reparations? Why do you think that we should be paid for what happened in Jim Crow, what happened with the black codes? We should be paid because they gave everybody land acts and land grants while we were still in slavery. And when we got out of slavery, they changed and depicted us as evil, and the people who were oppressing us as the heroes of the country. So just wanted to talk about the Morrill Act and also the Homestead Act. I know I missed a few things there. There were so many things I had to cover. But thank you for hanging in there with me. That was deep. Yeah, the two acts work together. Okay, the Homestead Act was for private land, and the Morrill Act was for colleges. Okay, so look if you can find for me. Do some homework. Look to see if you can find any of these colleges. I know we had some African Americans who became presidents and they were founders of the institutions. But how many of these colleges across the country actually were founded or built on black money that the African American man or the African man or the Native American man actually still has his hands, has a say in the college and university. So a lot of these universities are state universities, but they were given to congressmen to operate and facilitate and to take care of. At that time, there were no so-called black or African American congressmen at the time. So we're still waiting for our Homestead Act. We're still waiting for our Morrill Act. People call it reparations or whatever. But we're going to stop right there at about the early 1900s, the Birth of a Nation movie coming out. That totally turned history on its back. All the things that happened prior with slavery and civil rights, after civil rights, I'm sorry, not civil rights, but the Civil War, after the Civil War, that caused the African Americans to not be able to be enfranchised, was all left out of that movie. And so, still to this day, we're still struggling to understand why is it that there's a group of people in America that's considered a lower class people that seem to not be able to have ownership in anything in America, own less than 1% of anything, and is literally stuck in the working field unless they're athletes or entertainers. So just take a look at that, compare those two. Let me know what y'all think of this video. Please like and subscribe. Okay, I got a little longer on this video because we had to get deep. There was a lot of things to cover. If I miss anything, let me know. Y'all have a good day. Enjoy out there. If you need anything, I'm here for you. Definitely like and subscribe, and you can donate. Okay, the PO Box is 8708 Wilkinsburg, Pennsylvania 15221. The name is Fonanji, Fonnanji. This is a Fonanji, your social climate analyst. Checking out. We'll see you guys next time on the Social Climate.
We bout them good times when the skies is gray. Them sour lemons, we turn them to lemonade. Turn rain to sunshine, elevate to one mind. Demonstrate just one time. Come together and combine. The economics we showing. Industries we moving. In the streets we growing. Turn the black coal into shimmery and golden. Self-esteem perfect. Give a child dreams, cause you definitely deserve it. I don't wanna lie no more. All I want's the truth for you. All I want's the truth for you. I don't wanna lie no more. All I want's the truth for you. All I want's the truth for you.
The Truth for Youth Foundation, an association created for the betterment of all youth, all cultures, ethnicities, and backgrounds, are fighters to equal the playing field for youth whose ancestral history and cultures have been left out, misunderstood, or misrepresented in the environment they are subject to learn and be evaluated in. We want to raise awareness and funds that can go toward programming and curriculum that boosts individual growth, self-esteem, family structure, community development, and maintenance.
Y'all take care. Have a good one.